This is lecture 8B. So last time we talked about Greek, the growth of the Greek political system and the polis system and then the Macedonian Empire, etc. I want to turn now to Greek culture. Now, originally, the Greeks had a religion that was pretty similar to the other ones that we've seen from Mesopotamia or elsewhere, where you have a whole slew of different gods, and they're basically just superhuman people who are kind of they're flawed and they're subject to human foibles, etc. But they have kind of superpowers, and the religion was sort of transactional. You made offerings to the gods to get information from them or to get them to intervene to end a drought or what have you. And so, in that sense, Greek culture had a very standard, traditional approach that sounds a whole lot like what we're used to from some of these other civilizations. But beginning in the 800s, Greek culture starts to develop a different strain of culture. They start to develop a real strong sense of individualism and rationalism. Okay. Now we've seen in the case of China and in the case of Hinduism, etc., that in those cultures there's a strong strain of what we would call not individualism, in the sense that the individual is supposed to fulfill a role defined by their caste or their gender or their age or what have you. In Greek culture, the individual was not supposed to be determined by a role. There's a real strong sense of individualism that each person has to sort of figure it out for themselves and decide what their life is going to be like. And connected to that, Greek culture also starts to develop a really strong emphasis on human reason, that individual people can think through things and find the truth. And this comes out in a lot of different ways. First, I'm going to talk about some aspects of early Greek culture. First, Greek tragedy. The Greeks loved plays. They loved to put on plays all the time, and a lot of their plays were tragedies, where things end badly for the main characters. And so Greek tragedies often focused on this idea that individuals are striving to do something, to build an empire, to create great conquest, to do something, but that the individual is often weak and sort of helpless against the forces of fate or the gods or something like that. And often what the Greek tragedies focused on is that human beings had great talent and great ability, and they do great things, but they all often have a fatal flaw, that maybe it's hubris, they're too proud for their own good, or maybe they have some sort of blindness, they can't see some faults in other people, and so these flaws always sort of doom human beings to things ending badly. So the central sort of poignancy of Greek tragedy is this idea that the individuals can strive and they can do amazing things and have amazing abilities, and yet still in the end they don't succeed because life is always hard and fate can sometimes thwart you, and maybe it's all going to end badly anyway, so why do we even try? And so Greek culture, in that sense, emphasizes the individual, but it also emphasizes the sort of tragedy of the individual, that an individual is not powerful enough to really shape their own destiny, to choose their own path in life successfully. And maybe the best example of this is the play Oedipus. Really quick summary: in the play, Oedipus is a king of Thebes, and he gets an oracle that his wife is pregnant, and he says, well, what's my son's life going to be like? And he gets this oracle. The oracle says, your son is going to kill you and marry your wife. And he's like, oh my gosh, that's horrible. So he gives the son to a hunter or a shepherd and says, go drop this kid in the wilderness and let him die. But the shepherd says, sure, I'll do that, but then he doesn't want to, so he actually gives the child to somebody in a different city and says, take care of this child. And so the child, Oedipus, gets raised in a different city. Well, he turns 18 and decides to go out and make his fortune in the world, and he's going to go to Thebes because it's a nearby big city. And so he's walking along the road, and there's this guy coming in a carriage, and they get in an argument, and he kills the guy in the carriage, and he doesn't know it, but he's just killed his own father. So then he goes on to Thebes, and he finds that Thebes is in kind of chaos because, the king's not there, he's dead, but there's this beast, the Sphinx, the head of a woman and the tail of a serpent and wings of an eagle and the body of a lion. And the Sphinx terrorizes anybody who wants to get into Thebes. And what the Sphinx does is it asks a riddle, and if you can't ask the riddle, it kills you. Well, Oedipus goes up, the Sphinx asks the riddle, and the riddle is what goes on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs in the afternoon, and 3 legs in the evening. And the answer is humanity, because we crawl on all 4s as a child, and we walk on 2 feet as an adult, and then we use a cane and when we're old. And the Sphinx is so angry that she jumps off of the cliff, forgets that she has wings, and dies. So Oedipus has killed the Sphinx. He goes into Thebes, and they're so happy that he's killed the Sphinx, and they don't have a king. And so they say, well, why don't you marry the queen and become king? So he marries the queen, not realizing he's just married his own mother. And then everything looks great, but then a plague comes to the city, and Oedipus asks the gods, "What's the cause of the plague?" And he gets the message, he gets the message, somebody has committed, is committing incest and killed their own father. And he's like, "Well, I'm going to find out who did this." And so he does an investigation. He finds out it's him. And so once he discovers this, what he's done, he killed his own father and has been sleeping with his mother, he gouges his eyes out, and then he vows to go walk around Greece, giving other people the wisdom that don't think too big, don't have too much pride in yourself, because you never know what you've done. And so this sort of gives you a sense of, Oedipus has all these talents and these abilities. He's able to defeat the Sphinx. He's a good ruler, actually, but he's undone by fate, right? He was sort of doomed from the beginning by this prophecy. And so Greek tragedy always focused on this tension between the desires and wants and talents and abilities of the individual to try to make a great life and control things, but then the way that the world, fate, destiny always seems to thwart you. So Greek tragedy includes this strong strain of the individual against the world, kind of. But Greek culture also has a great deal of rationalism. The Greeks really developed sort of the beginnings of modern mathematics and science. For instance, the Greeks developed geometry and came up with the foundations of geometry with the the Pythagorean theorem came from ancient Greece, and Euclid was a Greek who wrote down, sort of the foundations of geometry. And then they transferred sort of a rational scientific approach to art and architecture. I mean, the arts have this real strong sense of individualism. If you look at Greek art, it's about human beings. It's about celebrating the human body and sort of the beauty of the athletic human body. But if you look at Greek urns, for instance, they have all sorts of pictures of people having parties and having sex and doing all sorts of very human things. So Greek art is really focused on human life, right? They're what we call humanists. They're focused on just what's human life like in the here and now, not what do the gods want and what's going to happen in the next life, but what's going on here right now. How can we celebrate that and enjoy that? Right? And so Greek art really celebrates human beings living in the present and the here and now and trying to get the most out of life, right? And Greek architecture is kind of interesting because it really has a strong rationalist sense to it. The Greeks really approached architecture. They said there must be scientific rules for what makes architecture beautiful. So let's figure them out. So they actually tried to decide what was the best ratio of height to width for a building to make it look the best. And they came up with the golden ratio of for building height to width to make it the most balanced and beautiful. And they actually even did things like they recognized that when you're standing at the bottom of a big pillar and you look up, if the pillar is perfectly straight, it actually looks it actually looks like it tapers because of the way the human eye perceives it. And so the Greeks would actually counter that by not having their pillars be perfectly straight, but having them curve slightly so that when you actually look at them, they look straight. So it's an optical illusion. So they have all these sort of scientific approaches to things and this real human focus. How can we make this enjoyable for human beings? How can we make this life enjoyable right now? So there's a lot of ways Greek culture really showed this individualism and a certain rationalism. And I want to turn now to talking about some of the big ideas in philosophy, because what's interesting about Greece is that it didn't just produce one big philosophy like Hinduism or Confucianism, and it didn't even, China, of course, had Taoism and what have you, But Greece is like everybody gets their own philosophy and their own religion. I mean, Greece was interesting because they had this transactional religion, but the Greeks also adopted other religions from elsewhere, right? They picked up Zoroastrianism, and they picked up the cult of Osiris from Egypt, and they developed mystery cults, and they had all sorts of different salvation cults, and they had different, a different religion every week is showing up in Greece, and then they had different schools of philosophy and different approaches to how to find the truth, etc. And so Greece was really kind of an open market free-for-all for ideas. So I want to talk about some of the major thinkers from Greece. And the first is Socrates, and Socrates is interesting because we only know about Socrates because of the writings of his student Plato. So Plato presents us with stories about Socrates and the Socrates ideas. We don't know if that's actually what Socrates was like, or if Plato is just putting words into Socrates' mouth and saying that's what I think Socrates was. But the gist of Socrates' story and thought is still significant. Socrates was supposedly famous for simply hanging out at the agora, the marketplace every day, and he would have conversations with people, and he had this very strange way of just questioning people. Like they would say, oh, I can't leave my wife, and I hate my wife, but I can't leave her. And he's like, well, why not? And he's like, well, divorce is unacceptable in our society. He says, well, why would that be unacceptable? And so he makes you examine the reasons behind your assumptions, and he often made people really uncomfortable because he could expose lots of really uncomfortable truths that people really didn't want to think about. But Socrates kept asking questions. And in particular, Socrates kept teaching young men who'd hang out with him how to ask those kinds of questions. And then they'd go back and quiz their parents and drive their parents nuts. And so finally, what Athens did is they decided to they charged Socrates with a crime, corrupting youth. And they put him on trial. And Socrates, and they basically said, Socrates is teaching young men to question everything, question the religion, question this class structure, question the government, question gender roles, question traditions. He's going to destroy society by making young men question everything. And Socrates' answer was, if anything in society is good, it can stand up to questioning, and if it's bad, you want to get rid of it. And questioning can help expose what's bad and what's good. He called himself a gadfly on society, buzzing around society and annoying it, but doing a very essential role, which is constantly making society ask if this is the best way to do things, and do we really want to believe this, and do we want to embrace this anymore? Right? So Socrates claims he's doing a service. Athens claims he's corrupting youth. In the end, he's convicted and condemned to die. He's supposed to drink hemlock. And some friends of his say, hey, we can get you out of Athens, and we can get you to Thebes or Corinth, and we have friends there. But Socrates said, no, I'm not going to, because I live in Athens. I agreed. By living in Athens, I agree to live by the laws of Athens. And by the laws of Athens, they can charge me with that crime, and I get a trial by jury, and I got one, and I got convicted. And so if I really believe in the laws of Athens, I want to be executed. And so he refused to escape, and he essentially drank the hemlock and died. And this had a profound effect on his students, because they said, wow, this guy really lives his beliefs. He's thought quite a bit. He's questioned everything in life. He has decided for himself what's right and wrong, and he has a code of conduct for life, and he lives by it, and he's willing to die for it. That's amazing, right? But this is a really individualistic approach. Socrates said each person has to be asking those questions themselves, making their own decisions, and then living by whatever they decide, right? Well, one of Socrates' students was Plato. And Plato had an interesting take. Plato wanted to explain everything. So Plato had an interesting take. He said basically, what we see, he wants to understand reality. He wants to understand the universe. And he says he actually thinks that what we see in the universe, right, trees and buildings and roads and other people, are not actually the ultimate reality. Because Plato said that every tree in reality here is a copy, it's built on the ideal form of a tree, right? And he says, and so there must be some essence of treeness that every tree shares, right? He says that essence of what a tree is the ideal of a tree, the ideal form of a tree. And he said, there must be another higher plane of existence where everything is the ideal forms. Every tree is the ideal, well, there is the ideal form of a tree, but there's also the ideal form of love, and there's the ideal form of government, and there's the ideal form of, whatever, everything. And so Plato said, we can't actually see those ideal forms. They don't exist in this world. But by studying this world, looking at all trees, and then using human reason, we can figure out what that ideal essence of treeness is, and then we really understand what trees are. And so Plato basically says we can study this world and use human reason to find the truth with a capital T, right? And so Plato's philosophy is to use human reason, examine the world, and try to understand the ultimate form of truth, right? Now, again, this is a very individualistic philosophy. And just as a side note, Plato had a famous allegory called the cave, where he said, if you imagine if you imagine a cave, and it's got a sort of a wall or a ledge at the front of the cave, and out here is the you've got the world, you've got trees, etc. outside the cave, right? Now imagine you have a person who's chained inside the cave. They're chained down here. Now this person cannot see, they're chained here, so they can't get up and look at the sun and the trees and the birds, etc. We'll add a bird here also. And so they can't see reality, but they can see the back of the cave. And the back of the cave is flat, so they'll see shadows flashing across the back of the cave. As a bird flies in front of the mouth of the cave, they'll see a bird's shadow across the back of the cave. When a tree sways in the wind, they'll see that in the back of the cave. And so Plato says this is sort of what human beings are like. We're stuck in the material world. We can't see the ideal forms of things. These are the ideal forms of things. But we can see reflections of them. The real world around us is sort of a pale reflection of reality. And we can use our mind, our imagination, to guess what that reality would be like and to sort of figure out what the truth is by just using the clues on the back of the cave or the clues in the world around us. All right, so Plato thinks there's an ultimate reality that we can access through human reason. Plato had a student named Aristotle, and Aristotle, interestingly enough, was actually, for a time, he was the tutor of Alexander the Great. Aristotle had a school in Athens, and when Philip of Macedon conquers, he asks the greatest philosopher living in Greece to tutor his son Alexander, and so he did. So Aristotle agreed with Plato on a lot of things. He was Plato's student, but he disagreed on some other things. And Aristotle came up with his own take. And basically Aristotle said, there are no ideal forms. There's no other plane of reality. There's just this. But he agreed with Plato that the way to find the truth is to examine things and to look for patterns and to say, look at all the trees and say, what is the essence of being a tree? What do all trees have in common? What can we say about the category of trees? And then to do that with everything. And Aristotle was an amazingly prolific writer. He wrote on politics and ethics, and he wrote on comedy, and he wrote on biology, and he wrote on gender roles, and he wrote on poetry, and he wrote on everything. All right. And he took a very rationalistic approach. He tried to understand things and study things. We know that he was actually, looking at animals and collecting specimens of animals to talk about biology. And he was a really clear thinker. But he got rid of Plato's idea that there was an ultimate reality that you could access. And he said, basically, we just got to make sense of this reality right here. We just have to figure it out, basically. Right? And so Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle all place this enormous burden on the individual to figure out the truth, right? They say, we're not going to hand you the truth. None of them had much use for religion. They were just sort of like, yeah, whatever. The truth doesn't come from the gods. You have to find the truth, right? So that puts an enormous burden on the individual, but it also means all of them said that the individual basically has to decide what's the best way to live their lives, to come up with a code of conduct, a moral, a set of morals, and then live by that, right? And so this is incredibly individualistic. And just very briefly, I want to talk about two other groups of Greek philosophy. One is the Stoics, and the Stoics basically said, you can't control life. Stuff happens all the time, but you can control your responses to life. So you can't control whether your loved ones are going to live or die, but you can control whether you're overcome by grief. You can't control whether you're going to get rich or poor, but you can control how you respond to that. All right? And so the Stoics basically focused on a philosophy of how you can manage your own emotions and manage your own responses to life, and you're supposed to live a moral life. You can't control what happens, but you can control whether your actions match your moral code, and you can control your own emotions. And so the Stoics sort of cultivated this idea that you never got too happy about good things because you know bad things are coming, and you never got too sad about bad things because you know good things are coming. And this allows you to moderate the ups and downs in life and to have better control of your own life and your own existence, and to better live by your own morals if you're not totally overwhelmed with grief or totally carried away by ecstasy or something. So the Stoics are sort of about self-control and self-management. The Epicureans take a different approach. They basically say the whole purpose in life is pleasure. But they don't mean, go out and have as much sex as possible and drink yourself to death and do piles of coke or something. What they mean is that you should focus on making the most pleasant, happiest life for yourself. And that means essentially, not gorging yourself on every food you come across, but rather saying, I'm going to eat really good food and I'm really going to enjoy that, but I'm going to do it in moderation so that I can do other things too. Right? And you're gonna cultivate all sorts of different talents and abilities, and you're going to become sort of sophisticated about knowing exactly what brings you happiness and what doesn't, and maximizing happiness and minimizing the pain in life. So again, this is about individual decisions, right? This is about individuals deciding how to live their lives and what's important to them, and this is a constant theme running through Greek culture. All right, so now I'm going to turn from the Greeks to looking at the successors to the Greeks, an offshoot of Greek culture, if you will, the Romans.